How are you? For those of you who have not had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Eckman previously, he is one of the world's foremost psychologists. His work has been incredibly influential, especially in the area of emotion. And Time magazine has said he's one of the most 100 influential people in the world. And I was thinking maybe 101, but he's been continually funded until his retirement by the National Institutes of Mental Health for over 40 years, and he's won almost every award in the field of psychology. And he's also had a relationship that goes back many years with the Dalai Lama. And in fact, he has a new book out. Did you bring just to plug his book? A new book based on his conversations with the Dalai Lama. And in fact, that's one of the things we're going to talk about tonight, is how that relationship actually affected his own life. And in many ways, it has also, I believe you would acknowledge, had an impact on how you interact with those around you as well.
And I've had an impact on the Dalai Lama's life. It's been a two-way street.
And in a humble way, he's also had a... Paul, getting, prior to you coming, we were talking about one of the things that always interests me, and which you acknowledge in the book, is your own backstory, which is, as I understand, your father was a pediatrician, your mother was an attorney, but then she had some issues, mental health issues, in your teens, and ultimately she committed suicide. And this had obviously an effect on the trajectory in many ways, I'm sure, in your own life. And I had shared with them a little bit of my own background prior to coming, how that, my own background, had really a profound effect. And maybe you could tell us how this changed how you were seeing the world or how you responded to the world, because I think you also acknowledged that you had difficulty with emotion control and anger yourself.
Yes, and I didn't actually, to start with. In fact, as a child, my parents would encourage me, Paul, fight back. Don't just be so peaceful. Don't let people take advantage of you. Don't let your sister keep beating you up. Hit her back. Stop her. But I was, if you can believe it, Jim, I was a totally peaceful kid until my mother's death, in which she asked for my help to save her, and I couldn't at 14. Actually, in 1948, when she killed herself, I don't think anybody could save a person with severe bipolar. There really wasn't treatment to speak of. And but that was decisive in two ways. One was that I decided then that it was my obligation to get the kind of knowledge that could help to save people like her. And I would say that up until 15 years ago, that was the principal motivation in my life. That's why I became a psychologist, originally intended to become a psychotherapist, found that you could be of more help to people through research. When I was drafted into the Army, of all things, that's a side story. Probably not time to get into. But the other thing that was decisive at that time was that I blamed my father for her suicide. Now, nobody's really responsible in that sense, but to a 14-year-old. And my mother's psychiatrist came up to me at her funeral and said, I tried as best as I could, but your father sabotaged me every step of the way. Not too professional of him. But I didn't realize that at 14. And in any case, my father was a physically abusive guy who used to beat me up. So I was intimidated and afraid of him, but I didn't hate him. But after my mother's death, I developed a strong hatred, which I've come to believe sort of poisoned my nature in the sense of making anger a more dominant part of my life. Really up until, well, I suppose I still would be at the high end of anger, not at the low end. But I'm more often, before my meetings and time with the Dalai Lama, I would say I had at least 3 or 4 times a week an angry episode that I regretted. There I either shouldn't have gotten angry, or I shouldn't have gotten so angry, or I shouldn't have expressed my anger in the way I did. That, incidentally, is Aristotle's 3 ways you can describe an intemperate person. Those 3 ways I've just mentioned. Now, I'd say that I have a regrettable angry episode now, maybe once in 2 or 3 months. So that's a huge change. Welcome change to me, to my family, to my friends. So that would bring us up to the time I met the Dalai Lama, which was in the year 2000. Now, I've been in the Bay Area a long time. I had refused to get involved with Est, with Synanon, with Delancey Street, with any of the fads that moved through, not just the laity. I mean, everybody in the psychiatry department at UCSF went through all these things, except me. And so I thought, the Dalai Lama, okay, Gandhi, that's all a good thing. I believe in nonviolence. I was very active in the Quaker part of the peace movement in the 60s and early 70s. But just the same people looked like another Bay Area fad. So I was keeping my distance from it. And I've been I guess I'd say an agnostic all of my life. How would I know? Actually, I was interviewed a couple of days ago by Bob Levinson, an old friend, at the Association for Psychological Science meetings. And the last question he asked me at the end of an hour interview was, what would you say if you met God? And I'd say, boy, was I wrong. When my daughter, Eve, was 14 or 15, she and some other students went trekking in Nepal with a wonderful teacher. And we didn't know that they'd spend their last 10 days, each kid, living with a different Tibetan refugee family in Kathmandu. So Eve came back, all fired up about Free Tibet, and organized the largest high school Free Tibet club in America, and boycotts. And Eve is an activist, still is an activist. I'm proud of her being an activist. I used to organize marches and protests, and I don't have to anymore. My daughter does that kind of thing. So I knew from a few of my colleagues who had gotten involved with contemplative practice, in particular with Buddhist approaches, that if you got invited to meet with the Dalai Lama at his palace in Dharamsala, you got to bring one silent observer. And I thought, wouldn't that be a kick for Eve? So I put my name in, and they would have probably invited me anyhow, because the meeting was on destructive emotions. And of course, I don't believe emotions are destructive. It's how you enact your emotions. If they were destructive, we wouldn't have had them. They wouldn't have been preserved over the course of evolution if they weren't useful to us. So I got invited, brought Eve, introduced her to the Dalai Lama as my spiritual leader. Said, she's the reason I'm here. And which was true. But for inexplicable reasons, within a few days, I felt like I had known this man all my life. And we developed a very strong connection. Now, I called it deja vu. Now, he was very glad to point out to me that all I've done is name it, not explain it. And that's true. We don't have any explanation for that and for many other mental phenomena. In this book, I list over 100 researchable questions that don't take rocket science or a lot of money about the nature of compassion that we just don't know the answer to. We could find out. 100 master's or Ph.D. dissertations could give us the answer to those 100 questions and let us know how or can we actually move towards a global compassion in time to save the planet. If we don't, the planet's not going to be the same place that we were born in, I don't think. In any case, in that meeting, a lot of things happened. Incidentally, the Dalai Lama believes we were brothers in a previous incarnation. We've now spent about 60 hours in one-on-one conversation. Now, I like to challenge everything he says, and he likes to challenge everything I say. And everything I take for granted, he doesn't. And everything he takes for granted, I don't. And I don't treat him reverentially. I won't call him Your Holiness. Now, he calls me Paul. So I can't call him Dalai Lama. He'd have to call me Professor, and he doesn't. I should call him Tenzin, but I can't bring myself to do it. Even though we hug and tickle and do all of that when we first see each other each time. So I call him my dear friend. My dear friend, what do you think of what I just said? It shows everything you said just a few minutes ago. It's absolutely wrong. Now, he had more training in debate than in meditation, and he's a masterful debater. And he debates with passion, but so do I. And neither one of us have rancor. We love disagreement. Disagreement, and we love to switch sides. I'll take his side, he'll take my side. Or we'll look for a third side. And we come up with new ideas that neither one of us had before. The book published right before this one's called Emotional Awareness. And that's just a slightly edited version of our discussions. It's all dialogue. It's not straight text. One chapter in this is dialogue, the last chapter, where he and I discuss this book. And you see the book is dedicated to him. I would never have considered compassion if it wasn't for him. He pushed me. He provoked me. He convinced me that the most important question before us is it really possible for us to feel the same way towards total strangers who are totally unlike us in every respect that we feel towards members of our family? That's asking a lot. And that's what he's asking. And we don't know whether it's possible. We could find out. We really could. And what should we be striving for? Should we be aiming to set the bar that high? Or should we regard it as something that only some people will reach? But maybe we can move them. My friend Matthew Ricard, a wonderful, wonderful Buddhist monk, a Frenchman, but has been in a monastery and building hospitals and schools in the back areas of Tibet for, over 35 years. Matthew believes it's like, he uses, and I quote him, the opening part of the book, he says we can all learn to throw the javelin better with practice, with training. But none of us, very few of us, will be Olympic javelin throwers. Well, is that the same for compassion? We can all move a bit in that direction, but we'll never develop the same feelings, the feelings of commitment, of caring that we have towards members of our family. Now, some people do have that. There are some people Not the majority, but there are some where compassion for total strangers is the centerpiece of their life. You may know some of them. Doctors Without Borders gives you an example, but they're in the city of San Francisco as well. So, but there are some people who are great actors. There's some people who are great musicians. Is this like that? Or is this something that's conceivably reachable for all of us? That's the question. I don't have the answer, but I know how to find out. But I closed my lab. I'm building online interactive tools to help people learn different emotional skills, but not to learn compassion. You've got to get the answers before we could know how to do that in a more thorough fashion. All we know is some people have it. We don't know why. We know that toddlers have it at the age of 2. And we know it's no longer there by 7 or 8. And we don't know why, but we could find out why. I'll keep pointing to this book.
But he doesn't want you to buy it.
It's a very, well, it's, I doubt that I'll make the costs. I got very involved in the design of the cover. The title is Moving Towards Global Compassion. And in the, if you publish it yourself, which I basically did, it's on Amazon and on Ingram, but I chose the font. I chose everything that, this is my 15th book, and the previous 14 are by publishers, and they made all those decisions and wouldn't let me have a word about it. They wouldn't even show me the jackets ahead of time. So this one I could do exactly the way I wanted. And it's a little book. It's only 100 pages, including its references and endnotes and footnotes. It's only 100 pages. It's a short read. But I do believe you have more chance of people reading if it's a short read, particularly if you're talking about the under 25 group. And they are, I can't resist reading you this one quote from this book. It's at the end of the book. I'm quoting the Dalai Lama. We have the capacity to think several centuries into the future. Start the task, even if it will not be fulfilled in your lifetime. This generation, I don't see many of you that are as old as I am. Your generation has a responsibility to reshape the world. We must ask ourselves about how we lead our life. In the service of what exactly are we using whatever talents we may have? To check our motivation, we must ask, is it just for me or for others? For the benefit of the few or the many? For now or for the future? Boy, I don't know a better set of questions for all of us to ask about the lives we lead. And for young people, people at this university and at all universities or high schools who are just at the point where lives are so much in transition, trying to figure out what should you do with your life. These are the questions you should ask yourself. That was a long answer.
Interestingly, I think one of the things, and you were talking about your own background and how that profoundly affected you, and anger, generally speaking, doesn't typically connect with openness and inclusiveness or engagement.
It can stop harm. It can be a force for social justice. It can motivate many positive things. There's harmful and non-harmful anger. I've just, we'll be putting on the internet in a couple of weeks on my website a segment from my last discussion with the Dalai Lama in which he explains when it's appropriate to get angry at the Chinese. Not to start with, but if they act in certain kinds of way, you should get angry with them.
Well, it's funny. I was doing a dialogue with His Holiness down at USC. I don't know if you saw it, but this was around the time of the assassination of Osama bin Laden. And I said, is it ever permissible to actually harm someone or to even kill them. And it was an interesting how he responded. He said, well, you know, if a mosquito comes on my arm, I'll swish it away. If it comes back on my arm again, I'll swish it away. But the third time, if it comes on my arm, I kill it. And so in the headline the next day in the paper was, Dalai Lama advocates assassination.
In the emotional awareness book, I have, we discuss, I say to him, suppose, because I was trying to push him as far as I could push him. I still like to push him as far as I can push him. And he likes it because he doesn't want to be treated reverentially. You know, it's boring to have everybody bowing and scraping. Your Holiness, this. I mean, that's how you address the Pope. He's the exact opposite of most popes. This Pope is, you know, getting near the borderline. But I said to him, suppose you're standing on a little hill above a schoolyard, and standing there is a man with a machine gun. And you ask him, what are you doing with the machine gun? He says, I'm waiting for the children to come out into the playground so I can kill all of them. And you try to convince him he shouldn't do that. And you hear the bell ring, and the kids start to come out, and he puts it up like this, finger to the trigger. What should you do, Dalai Lama? He says, pick up a stone and hit him as hard as you can. Kill him. Stop him. And there are many stories in Buddhist texts about, I mean, in actuality, this is their, I was going to say fairy tale, but I didn't. I bit my tongue. This is what their belief system allows, that if you kill him, you're doing him a favor, because you're preventing him from coming back as a mosquito, okay? You're preventing him in his next incarnation. Now, if I killed him, since I don't believe that, that's I have to be much more willing to feel there's justification to take another person's life. It's the hardest thing for me to empathize with. I try as hard as I can to try to get into the mind of a terrorist. And I've done and continue to do work on counterterrorism, but I can't get, maybe I've had too privileged a life to know what it feels like when you feel you have no choice but to try to kill other people. I know there are people like that. And I know that from their framework, they're not crazy. They think they're acting ethically. That makes it even more frightening than it is.
Well, I think that gets back, though, to our discussion, or actually the premise of your book, is how do we get to this global compassion? You yourself here, who have now had these extraordinary interactions with His Holiness, I'll use that term because I'm an atheist, you've had these incredible interactions. They profoundly changed you. You admit now, actually, you could not put yourself in the place of the terrorist. So when you talk about extending this compassion, are you telling us you can't do it yourself?
No, I think I actually lead a life with global compassion. But I would, in that same spot I put the Dalai Lama, I would try to kill the man with the machine gun, too. And I spend at least a third of my time trying to catch terrorists or identify who they are. And I have no regrets about our assassinating Osama bin Laden.
Some people would argue that one of the issues here is, and we see this play itself out if you look at politics, you can have all the facts on your side, you can have all the studies. We know that oftentimes when people have a fixed opinion, instead of being open and you look at the facts and you go, oh, well, 97.2% of climate scientists think that humans affect global warming, and it would seem for a logical person that you would sit there and go, wow, I'm not a climate scientist, 97.2%? Well, then that must mean that humans actually are responsible for climate change, yet we have a group of people who absolutely refuse to believe that. And what happens is instead of saying, wow, that's an amazing statistic, I need to change my mind, human nature is such that instead of doing that, what happens, you double down, right? You sit there and go, absolutely not, I will not accept this or believe this. They've got to be wrong, or that 0.8%, they're the ones who actually have the facts, and the 97.2% are all wrong. And the point being that, while you may say, geez, I spent a lot of my time chasing terrorists, but the challenge is, unless you change the hearts of individuals and show openness, kindness, an open heart, they may not change, but I think that's the only thing that's going to have any potential effect, because you have to win their hearts, I think.
Well, I think you do, but you probably wouldn't be alive if some of the terrorists that I've helped catch weren't caught. So it's just a matter of saving lives. It's primary concern to me. My primary concern is try to improve emotional life, but even before that is to try to prevent people from taking the lives of others, unless it's to stop them from harming even more people. So I have no qualms at all about trying. I do believe in the long run, and that's what global compassion would mean. It would mean that you would be willing to share your resources with total strangers, which means that your level of living would go down quite a bit, because we in China and some of the European, we use the lion's share of the world's energy, food, water. So you can't continue to do that if you're going to engage in global compassion and you're going to deal with the people who are in desperate straits, and there are a lot of them. So again, we have to move in that direction, but we also, I believe, and that's why I split my time between these various pursuits, have to try to stop the people who are trying to kill us.
Well, maybe just to extend this discussion a little bit further. So if we look at what's estimated to be $4 to $6 trillion, which is the cost of Iran, Iraq, and Pakistan interventions spread out over the next several years, and you look at what $4 to $6 trillion could do to actually have an impact in other places where, at least nominally, it appears as though it's not going to have an impact anywhere. And this was an attempt to stop terrorists. Then we look at the TS.
Oh, well, no, come on. I won't let you get away with that. I mean, that's straight politics. And,
I'm just asking.
I didn't support President Bush. I voted against him. But, democracies make mistakes. This was a mistake. I think almost everybody now realizes it. Poor Bush's brother doesn't think he can run because he's got the name associated with those mistaken wars. They were mistakes. But we've gotten terribly far. We're in politics now. I'm not an expert in politics. Ask me about emotion or compassion. I don't want to talk about politics.
Well, but I
really don't.
No,
I really don't.
I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about.
That was politics. Those were those wars, and we could have spent the money differently. That's a matter of politics. Politics are off the table. I won't discuss political issues.
I'm not trying to discuss politics, actually.
Well, I heard it that way. You're talking about we could have spent that money and done a lot more good. Yes, but politically we decided not to. And Bush was elected twice in this country. Maybe once it was a little doubtful, but in any case, that's the realm of politics. I'm interested in what we can do to improve our emotions, our emotional life, and to cultivate compassion to the extent that it's possible, and to finding out whether it is possible to cultivate compassion for total strangers in everyone, or maybe just in more than we currently have. Those are the questions that I'd like to discuss, not about where the United States should have spent its trillions of money. That's politics.
No, I was just responding to your question about how you were commenting on how you spend your time preventing terrorist activities, but
not by engaging in political activity. My political activity at the moment is limited to trying to get the apartment house where I live to repair the elevators so we can get up to where we live and don't get stranded for hours at a time with no way of getting to your apartment. I'm only and I'm trying to see that the voters of San Francisco will pass something that says if you want to change the height limits, you have to put it before the public. That's where I'm putting my money, my effort, my picketing, etc. Those are all very local issues. I used to work in national politics, and I wrote speeches for Bobby Kennedy. I did research that influenced policy towards Cuba, towards Vietnam, not far enough. It would have if Kennedy hadn't been assassinated. So, but I don't work in the area of politics anymore. And I don't know, I'm not an expert about politics. I'm an expert about emotion. I'm an expert about deception. And now I think I have made a contribution. I wouldn't consider myself an expert about compassion, but I've thought of questions and distinctions that other people haven't thought of that I think could be useful in moving our knowledge forward. So those are the things I'd like to discuss.
So getting to the book, and I haven't had the opportunity to read the entire book, only a few chapters that Susan sent me. But in turn,
You're getting a copy here today.
I don't know now. I'm going wait. You mentioned that there are several studies that could be done that could answer some of these questions.
Over 100.
Right,
over 100 separate studies.
Okay.
And they're not rocket science. And they wouldn't cost $50,000 each. Yeah. They're right within the scope of what a master's or doctoral student could do.
Maybe you could just share 3 or 4 with us that you think are the most powerful in terms of, and maybe we can either encourage some extraordinarily wealthy or not so wealthy benefactor to fund such a study, or we could inspire one of the young people or not so young people to embark on this.
I think what we need to do is to, that's why we're making this available to students at cost. They can get from us a code they can put into Amazon and get a copy of the book, is we need to get students to be working on these research questions. Most of them they will be able to do without any funding. So let's see if I can give you. Are compassionate actions always preceded by a conscious awareness of compassionate feelings? We don't know the answer to that, but I explain how you can get an answer. And that's an important thing. Do we have to cultivate? We do know that some of the people who act impulsively, without thought, in a split second, they jump down into the subway and rescue someone, they don't report any compassionate feelings. They just felt, they give you the same answer, and I make a big point of this. If you ask a mother, why did you put your own life at risk? If you asked me when I ran out in front of a car to pull back my 3-year-old daughter who thought it was really funny to make dad so upset by running in front of cars, and I put my own life at risk to save hers. If you ask me why did I do that, it's a stupid question. I had to do that. I had no choice. Well, that's what the people who rescued Jews in Germany say when you ask them, why'd you do it? Because they're human beings. I had to do it. That's what, when you ask the guy who went in front of the subway track, I didn't think about whether I had to do it. I didn't have time to think. I just did it. It's involuntary. Now that suggests the possibility that there are some people for whom family incorporates everyone. Now I think when you become a parent, you become in some sense a parent to all children. Your scope of concern widens. It isn't just your children you try to do something for, it's any child. But what about the adults? What about the adolescents? What about the totally strangers? I have a blog about why that appeared on the Huffington Post last week. Why do we watch people suffering? Why do we watch the Nigerian girls on television? We couldn't do anything about it. Why did we watch it? Why do we watch people suffering when there's nothing we can do about it? There are more than one answer to that. We could find out the answer. But it's an important question. Because listen, if we switched channels when you showed people suffering, they wouldn't show it. But we don't switch channels. In fact, we switch channels to watch people who are suffering. Now, I think it's sort of built into our nervous system to want to help people who are suffering. When I worked in New Guinea 50 years ago, not 60, the village that I spent most of my time in was about 150 people, and those people never left their village. And if you saw someone suffering, they were someone you knew, and you could go up and at least console them. Now, they didn't have antibiotics, so a lot of people died of things, just, surface cuts that got infected. But at least you could console them. So I think we evolved as a species to want to help suffering, and now we're bombarded with the suffering of everyone in the world because it makes us watch television and help sell soap. And we can't do anything about it. And what does that do to us? Does that sharpen our compassion? Does it weaken it? We don't know the answer to this. Is it the same for all? There are very few things that are the same for all people. One of the fundamental truths about human nature is we differ one from another. One of the few things we all have in common is emotions. That's why the Dalai Lama really loved my work. I was at a meeting in Vancouver. That was a decisive meeting. It was about 2 years after the meeting in Dharamsala, 2000. And I went up, Victor Chan was organizing this meeting. And it was about opening your heart, which really means being compassionate. That's just another way of putting it in the Buddhist terminology. And there, the first person to speak was a famous Christian theologian, and the second was a famous Muslim woman who got the Nobel Prize, Iranian woman, and the third was a very well-known rabbi, and the fourth was a Native American woman. They all said, what opens my heart is my religion, my belief in God. And the Dalai Lama, when he spoke last, he laughed. He looked at each one of them, he laughed. Don't you know what has caused the most killing in the last 2,000 years are religions who kill you because you don't believe in their God? The only thing that unites us, he said, is our emotions, because that's what we all have. I thought to myself, oh my God, he doesn't realize that our emotions also divide us. So I need to try to talk to him. That's why we started this series of conversations and about what is it in our emotions that unite us and what divides us. It is true. We all have the same emotions, but we experience them in somewhat different ways because they don't come. We're not like maleo birds. A maleo bird, I saw one when I was working in Sumatra. A maleo mother buries the egg in volcanic sand, which is warm, and she flies off. She never sees the offspring. So the offspring has to be born knowing everything it needs to survive, because no parent's going to teach us. Well, we're at the opposite end of the continuum. We have the longest period of dependency to survive, and that allows us to learn all kinds of things. But we don't learn the same things because we're brought up in different families. We're not all members of one family. And so these emotions are played out on what we have learned in the course of growing up in very different ways. I expect to have an interactive online tool that will allow you to graphically explore what's the unique way in which you feel emotions and how does that differ from how an intimate partner experiences emotions. But it won't be ready until this winter. I don't take investment money, so one thing bootstraps and pays for another. So that's why I'm taking. That one's been 5 years and it works while we accumulate enough money to get it programmed. So The emotions unite us, they divide us. But when I saw that I thought he was sort of overplaying the positive impact of emotions. Incidentally, hatred is not an emotion. It is, the Buddhists call it a poison, and I agree. It does change. The longer you maintain hatred, which is anger focused on a particular person, intense anger on a particular person is hatred. The longer you maintain it, the more it's going to warp and distort your personality. So you want to be, anger is okay, particularly if it's constructive anger, but not hatred is a poison to avoid. Now, I don't know where that long answer began, but that's the end of it.
Okay, one more question. It's interesting because you were talking about this global compassion and how individuals, and you use the example of Mathieu, is it really necessary where you have to be sort of the super javelin thrower to actually create this environment of global compassion? Or do we just have to set the dial up a little bit, since probably most of us are not, if you will, at the high end of the thermostat for our compassion? If that is in fact the case, should we look at interventions then as a method or the method to actually have this effect on individuals? Or what are the ways in which you think that could occur on a scalable level?
Glad you asked that question.
He paid me.
Thank you very much. I didn't? Thank you very much, though. In this book, I make I'm a taxonomist. I believe in making distinctions until the evidence suggests you need to collapse them. Better to start out with more than with less, because you'll never find out if you start out with less that you need more. So I distinguish compassion in terms of whether it's focusing on feelings or actions, or both. I distinguish it in terms of what kind of suffering, and I distinguish 3 types of suffering. The first 2 are easy to describe, so I'll mention those and leave you to read the book to find out the third one. The first one is immediate physical or mental pain, suffering. The second is a malaise, sort of discontent with life. The third, more in Buddhist terms, is an aspiration. It's a little harder to describe, so I'm going to just give you those 2. But then I distinguish 5 types of compassion in terms of who the target is. So we've got 3 kinds of suffering. We've got an emphasis on feelings or actions, so that's 5 times 2. It's 10 times now. Now, I think the critical one is the distinction between proximal and distal compassion. Proximal is when you're dealing with something that's right happening now. Distal is when you're dealing with something that could happen in the future you want to prevent. You want to prevent future suffering. They're both focused on suffering. Okay. Unlike the emotions. One of the reasons why compassion is not an emotion. I can be afraid of anything. Compassion is focused just on suffering. But as a parent, I didn't have too many opportunities for proximal. My kids were fortunate. A few times they fell and scraped their leg, or they got rejected by a school friend, or later by a lover. So that was immediate physical or mental pain. But most of the time, I was engaging in distal. Wear a helmet. I don't want them to get injured. Don't use hard drugs. Study hard. These are all distal compassion to prevent suffering in the future. Now, while proximal is much more emotionally based, distal is cognitive, not much emotion. What does it require? Good social forecasting. The ability to know what are the troubles that lie ahead that we need to try to do something to prevent an increase in suffering. That's educable. That's where I think, and the Dalai Lama agrees, the resources should really go, is into inculcating in the schools, if we can, and it has to be completely secular, good social forecasting to prevent future suffering, not just for themselves, but for everyone in the world. So that's, I think, probably the most important distinction that I draw among the many here. And for an emotion scientist to be emphasizing something that's more cognitive just shows you how much my perspective has broadened. So I say, no, cognition is really important, and it's an entry point. It's education. And we need to there are programs going on, but they're not as sharply focused on social forecasting and the commitment to work to bring about those kinds of changes that will benefit all of us.
Do you think, recently we saw the cover of Time magazine with mindfulness on it, and that's become the latest, you call it Est Echelon and all the others. Do you feel that has a place? Do you think it's overplayed? Do we understand it enough?
Dalai Lama says it's kindergarten. If you haven't been to kindergarten, you need to go, but it's not the exercises you need to cultivate compassion, even proximal, let alone distal. So, you should, to the extent that it's possible, I think there are more ways to achieve mindfulness than through contemplative practice. My daughter Eve teaches a course. She's actually trained now over 200 people to teach the same course, which the Dalai Lama asked me to do in the 4th day of our meeting, looking directly at me. There are only 5 of us at this meeting, plus the observers. He said, is this just going to be good talk, good karma, or is anything going to happen because of this meeting? And he's looking right at me. And I said, I don't know why in the world I'm saying this, but I've changed. I'm an optimist. I think I can make something happen. Suppose Dalai Lama, even then I was not calling him Your Holiness. I don't call anyone holy. Nobody's holy.
Maybe everybody's holy.
And then you're a believer in a God, and I'm not a believer in a God. I said, suppose the governor said to you, I want to make the prison guards more compassionate. What would we need to do? And he outlined what he thought we needed to do. And that's what this Cultivating Emotional Balance program, that's how it came into being. We did it with San Francisco school teachers who had no previous contact with contemplative practice. It was a 48-hour training program, and the research showed, and there was a control group, as much benefit in terms of decreases of various forms of stress, from cortisol to anxiety measures, as has ever been reported in the literature. Okay? So it does benefit you. And 48 hours is not a lifetime, and it was 3 or 4 hours a week plus 2 weekend one-days. And so that now there are about 200 people who have been trained to teach this. My daughter has done the training, she and Alan Wallace. And so that's a useful program. It's a step in the direction that we need. Emotional balance, mindfulness, is step 1. Some kind of emotional balance, knowledge about your own emotions. That's what I've been writing books about, and that's what I've now developed online interactive tools. First step being to better recognize how you feel. If I don't know how you feel, I can't do anything. And schizophrenics become equal to normals in less than an hour using one of our online tools. Salesmen become more successful. Policemen make less mistakes. These things really work, and it doesn't take long. And it's fun to do. It's a game. And you can learn it on my internet site, pauleckman.com. So
I was going to say, you sound like Vice President Gore.
Now, the second tool, which will become available in the fall, says, I know how you feel. How do I use that information most constructively? And we deal with 3 kinds of social contexts. When you tell an adolescent something they didn't want to hear, that's going to restrict their freedom. When you tell an employee they didn't get a promotion they were hoping for. When you tell a criminal suspect you've got proof positive they committed a serious felony, and if they can confess, you might be able to get them a better deal. 3 different contexts. Each one, you get different emotional reactions shown. You have to choose what to say. You get feedback from me all online. I'm no longer there. I'm there in the online feedback. So it's taking the next step. The next step being to figure out how to respond to another person's emotions most constructively. And then the next step is the one I mentioned before, the profile tool. How's the way in which I experience emotion different from someone I'm intimately involved with? Could be my spouse, could be my offspring. I suppose it could be your employee. So those are trying to help people with their emotions. With compassion is a much tougher, if you're going to get it on a global level, you're going to get it on a level that we need, I believe. I said to the Dalai Lama that in the 19th and 20th century, you could be a rugged individualist and figure, screw everybody else, just for me and mine. They'll take care of themselves. If they don't, it's not my problem. Why didn't they? Can't do that anymore. You can't do that anymore, not only because of resource shortage, but something I didn't put in. This is the nice thing about an electronically based book. I'm going to put it in the 2nd edition, which the 2nd edition will come out in a week, because I can go ahead and make that change. And that is, if people didn't like what we did, we used to be protected by an ocean or by technology and a big army and the NSA and all of that kind of stuff. But guess what? It doesn't take much technology to bring in biological weapons to an American city and kill millions of people. And if people are discontent, they may do that. That's called terrorism. And all the technology in the world doesn't protect you against it. So if for no other reason than that one, you better be willing to adjust your sights and share more of the resources of the world. That's not a very nice motivation. But every motivation needs to be considered. And for some people, that might move them, while others might not.
I think some people may not appreciate, we have about 300 million people in the U.S., yet we consume 25% of the world's resources, right? So it's a huge, huge, huge issue.
We should feel good that the Chinese are just as bad as we are. They're worse in terms of polluters than we are, but they're just as bad and a much worse human rights record. Are we going to take audience's question?
In just a minute.
Okay.
So one more question. Sometimes there's the issue, and you had mentioned this earlier, of thinking out into the future, and you quoted the Dalai Lama saying you have to think beyond the present. And this gets into, if you will, the argument or the discussion about the ant versus the grasshopper. Do you have any thoughts on that? And this idea is the issue of a lot of people want to be satisfied immediately versus, it's somewhat harder to sit there and say, I'm going to sacrifice today for 100 years from now where I'm not here and I'm hungry or I want to do X, Y, or Z today and use these resources.
I think our focus, and the Dalai Lama agrees, actually it's getting we are agreeing too much these days. We've got to move into another area of discussion where we're going to disagree more.
I was trying to talk about politics. But
no, not with you, with the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama and I never talk politics. And he's no longer a political leader, just a spiritual leader.
I think you influenced him.
No, he's a year younger than I am, and he's decided it's not the time to stay in politics any longer. I think we should let the over 70 crowd go. Okay. Maybe you should have lived your life differently, maybe not. What you did, you you're not the ones who are going to change the world. Let's focus our efforts on the 15 to 25-year-olds, 15 to 30-year-olds. Perhaps to some of those in the 40s who are usually in a position of more influence. That's where we should put our attention. So they'll get payoff in their lives, and they'll get punishment in their lives too, because the shortage of resources, the climate change. I mean, the most recent thing that I read that's so disheartening, because the Dalai Lama made me into an optimist. I was a happy pessimist all of my life. And then my friend made me into an optimist. And to read that there's no going back, it's too late, the melting of the ice. That the flooding, I mean, where I live in the city of San Francisco is 2 blocks into the bay. When that flooding occurs, if I was still alive, the apartment building would be flooded. All of lower Manhattan will be underwater. And you can look at the maps now, they're pretty reasonable projections. And we can't stop that. We've got to stop the rest of the abuse of this planet that we want to, if not for us, then for our children. We want them to have the same planet that we have, the same opportunities. That's the wonderful thing, I think, about parenting, is that it's built into us to want our offspring to be able to do well. If it wasn't built into us, this species wouldn't be here today. Will it be here tomorrow? I don't know, but I won't be here to find out. But many of you in this audience will be here to find out. And partly it depends on what you yourself do. That's quite a pitch.
I think on that note, we're going to have questions. There's microphones on either side, but they're going to be abbreviated questioning at this time just because of time. And maybe this young lady, you look incredibly prepared, and you have a notebook. Is your question written out?
Hi, Jim. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Pam.
So,
Speak into the microphone. It's hard to hear you.
okay. So I wanted to ask if you have any favorite portraits of compassion as living art or as, quote, traditional art, and if someone were to try to do an actual portrait of an individual on compassion, not the emotion, would they need somebody being fully available, like Jimpa says, in the face of suffering, and would they need sadness, and would they need 5 stages with Dr. Keltner tilting his eyebrows up? Or what do you envision representing or signifying or signaling a good image for portraits of compassion?
If there's anything I know less about than politics, it is art. But looking at what's been sent to me, there are a lot of images, sculpture, paintings, dealing with compassion that have been accumulated by people and put together. So there obviously could be more. And what we really don't know, I don't know, somebody knows, I'm sure, is how much of this is pan-cultural. If you looked at how compassionate acts have been depicted, and they have been depicted, certainly in all the Abrahamic religions, and I think in Hinduism as well, and by the Jains I know as well. So what's the difference in how they're depicted visually? Compassionate actions. Be fun to know.
And then the other flip side of that is, are we supposed to show terrorists as disgusted and contemptuous? I mean, what is the face of terrorism?
That's a problem that I've been working on for about 10 years. Actually, I've been working on the face of the assassin. What does the assassin look like right before they strike? But you still have time to stop them. Because we have a lot of police that are assassinated in this country. And as you can see, all kinds of people are assassinating all kinds of people in this country that we live in with all kinds of weapons. So I have some leads on that, but nothing I'm willing to make public. So I'm working on it. I don't know whether I'll get a definitive answer or not. I've been working on it with the aid of the Secret Service for 15 years.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Dr. Eckman. I'm wondering if, I love Matthew Ricard, but I want to challenge him. I wonder if compassion is like Dr. Keltner calls it an instinct, and Sadhguru is here for a conversation on compassion. He actually said, you might be strong, physically more powerful than somebody else, you might be more intelligent, but in terms of looking inside and developing like inner going into the mind, going inside, we're all the same. And so I'm wondering if compassion is an instinct, if you see it as an instinct that like we are born with, like boys are born with a full emotional spectrum, but by the time they're 5 and 6, they're anger-based. And if it's something that we lose in our socialization, and so the process of getting it back would be not developing it, but coming back to it.
Well, there is evidence, but not definitive evidence, to suggest that, well, actually, I think familial compassion, that is compassion towards your immediate family members, that's wired in. I wouldn't use the word instinct because that carries a lot of other baggage. Can it be damaged? Maybe. Maybe trauma can damage it. Do you feel as much compassion towards your 40-year-old offspring as towards your 4-month-old offspring? As much towards your cousin as you do towards your brother? Towards your child? We're in the area of questions, we don't know. But going outside the family, then it's clear to me, if it's not activated or active in the majority of people on this planet. Could it be? We could find out. We don't have the knowledge base to know now whether it could be, and if so, how. But we could find out. These are not hard questions to answer. They just haven't been asked explicitly. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Dr. Eckman. Hey, science has a history for us as being very definitive, not having an offspring of multiple necessary answers, but like a singular answers, very case in point kind of idea. You know, in America, we focus on like the one size fits all shirt. We want to like name everything. We want everything to kind of work for everybody. We want like blanket statements, things that make sense for everybody. So in that context and with that idea, do you think that compassion comes from a national conscience? Like a nation has an idea of what's right or wrong, right? Getting to the political America, police of the world, right? So do you think compassion comes from a national conscience, or does it come from somewhere else, or is that a part of it? Is that a large part of it or a small part of it?
Well, compassion towards strangers, which is what I presume you're asking about, not familial compassion. I already answered. Familial compassion is wired in. You don't have to learn it. You don't have to be taught it. If parts of your brain are damaged, you won't have it. And trauma might prevent it, but normally it's there. Right. But compassion towards strangers isn't there in most people. Nevertheless, the United States has the distinction of more charitable giving than any other country in the world. So that's part of the heritage too. But not everyone. When the tsunami occurred, more people in the United States, if you correct for population, there were still more contributions by Americans than any other country in the world. Not just because we're a big country, because if you correct for population, we still come out on top. However, most people didn't. What's the difference between those who did and didn't? That's an answerable question. We could know. We don't know now. So in order to answer your question, we'd have to do some of the research that I'm calling for. There isn't a religion that I'm familiar with, and I've talked to religious experts, so I think I'm on good ground on this. All the major religions of the world emphasize compassion. And yet, in all of those countries, except unreliable reports that I've been given that Tibetans are universally compassionate. I doubt it. But certainly not those who kill other Tibetans who disagree with them, and that does occur in Tibet. So I don't think it's any one culture, nor is it any one animal species, although I am told that, God, I'm losing the name of this particular, they live up in the trees in Borneo. Orangs. I'm told by those who have studied orangs that they are compassionate towards people, towards animals that are not in their species. There's a recent photographic series of a lioness being compassionate towards a baby baboon. So, but that's a baby, that makes it easy. But that's a start. So maybe it's in many places. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Suffering, pain, crisis play a big role in our lives. Even your stories have underlined how big a role traumas played in who you became. So my question is, if you actually succeed in compassion and you decrease, remove, or shield people from suffering, wouldn't it is there a risk that it will make us shallower and decrease diversity?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Yeah,
So my question is, like, if you remove suffering, wouldn't it make us
boring.
yeah?
Well, I think the likelihood of removing suffering will not occur before the sun goes dark. I don't think you can remove suffering. I think suffering on one level or another, whether it's physical suffering, psychological suffering, malaise, or some sense of the limits of life itself. Suffering is part of life, just like birth and death are part of life. You can't eliminate suffering. You can try to help with particular instances, and comforting doesn't remove suffering, but it may make the person who's suffering feel a little better about their suffering. And of course, there are instances where you can completely relieve that particular occasion. That's not the case most of the time. So I'm not worried about removing suffering.
One more question, and unfortunately our time is going to be done, I believe.
Hi.
This has to be the deepest, most penetrating.
Try. It's actually a pretty practical question.
Can you talk right into the microphone?
Sure. My question is this. You talked about the anger and hatred you felt for your father after your mother committed suicide.
Hatred, not anger, hatred. Different. Critically different.
Did you ever get over the hatred? And if
Yes.
so, how?
It was one of the unexpected byproducts of all of my work with the Dalai Lama. And, well, I may as well leave you with a mystery, because that would please my friend the Dalai Lama. He differs from me in thinking it will always be a mystery. Things that were a mystery 50 years ago aren't a mystery now. But there's still many things. I was brought up to believe that if we couldn't measure it, it doesn't exist. Oh, I now know that's wrong. I was also brought up to believe if we couldn't understand it, that means it doesn't exist. That's also wrong. There are a lot of things we don't understand at this point in time. Now, he thinks we'll never understand them. I think we will eventually, but that's a matter of faith. We each have faith in different things. I have faith that science will eventually unravel the mysteries that at least are relevant to most of our emotional life, and probably to the nature of compassion. But that's a matter of faith. So here's the mystery. In the third day of the meeting with the Dalai Lama, during one of the breaks, where people could get up and stretch their legs. He would never get up. I don't know how he did it, but he would never get up. And that was a time when observers could come and ask him a question. So my daughter and I went up so she could ask him a question. She wanted to ask him the question, how can you say anything about love if you've never been in love? If you've never had a sexual experience? But she didn't do that. Instead,
Well, I've had sexual experiences and haven't been in love.
She asked him instead the question, why do we get the angriest at those we love? It's a good question. He gave a good answer. I'm not going to give you the answer. I'm going to tell you. While she and he talked for 10 minutes, he took both of my hands in his. And I was filled with a unique set of physical sensations that I've never experienced before or after. What comes the closest to it is when you're going to get a scan, a CT scan, and they inject you with this dye, and your whole body for a few seconds feels warmth from the tip of your toes to the top of your head. Well, this was most similar to that, but it was better because it really felt wonderful. I didn't know what in the world it was. And it lasted for quite a few minutes. Afterwards, I told my daughter about it. And then I noticed the next morning when somebody gave a really boring academic presentation, I didn't get impatient. And for the next 7 months, I never had a moment of anger. For 7 full months, I never got angry at anyone about anything. Now, the people around the Dalai Lama had seen this happen before with other people. And so I, being a scientist, not being able to understand what had happened to me, I was very grateful. Can you imagine if you have 2 or 3, 4 regrettable, angry episodes every week? Suddenly you're never getting angry. It's like I was back as I was as a child. Stripped of anger. What a relief. So I interviewed 8 people that had the same experience. And what I found was they were all at a transition point in their life. I was about to retire. I didn't because of the project he asked me to undertake. Others had just recovered from a life-threatening illness, a divorce, change of employment. They were at transition points. Second, they had all had a major emotional trauma, a major wound that had never been resolved in childhood or adolescence. That's what we shared in common, those 2 things. Nothing else. Most of them had no physical contact with him. None of them had their child present. I thought maybe that was it. So I still don't understand it. I'd like to. The chances that I will in my lifetime seem very unlikely. And he thinks I'll never understand it, nor will anyone else. And it's the only issue he was unwilling to discuss. I believe, although he won't comment on this, I said, you won't talk about this because you don't want to be seen as a healer, even if you are. It's a mystery. That's all he'll say. Just he repeats that often enough, I'll change topics. So it's a mystery. Changed my life. If I was in my 40s, that's what I would try to study. How's this happening? What's the process? What does it take? Is there any way? Is it? Now I get a little bit of that when I hold hands with Matthew Ricard, who I'll be seeing in July in London, who's coming out with a 700-page
Yeah.
or 400-page
700.
book on altruism. I saw an earlier draft, and I gave him, I said, Matthew, the number of people who are going to read 700 pages is a really tiny, can't you write something shorter to try to reach people? But no, I mean, he's a scholar. His father was Francois Revel, the leading French philosopher along with Sartre in post-World War II. So he's brought up in that tradition. But I get a little of that same experience when I hold hands with Matthew. So, and there have always been people throughout history have been described as having this capability to change others. And I'll tell you this, when you're in the presence of the Dalai Lama, it feels good. The goodness is palpable. It's thick. And we in the West have no conceptual framework, let alone tools, for comprehending what that sentence I just spoke means. But I believe, as a matter of faith, someday we will. And I hope it's in your lifetime, because it's powerful. It's a powerful way some people can influence others for the better.
I think on that note, we're going to end this evening. Thank you all so much.
Let me also thank Jim for putting this on. And this is really... it's really the only public event we're doing around the launch of this book. And if any of you are interested in coming up and taking a look, but not taking, feel free to come up and take a look at the book. And again, thank you, Jim, for the opportunity.
Thank you. Take care, all. Paul, thank you.